Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. This subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on examining the President's fiscal year 2020 budget proposal for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses and keep members on schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. So thank you all for joining us to examine the President's proposed budget for these two important agencies. The committee has many concerns regarding the President's budget proposal. The President has made clear in this and past budgets that he does not value oceans, wildlife, or the communities that depend on healthy ecosystems. This budget proposes deep cuts to science and conservation that would significantly hinder the ability of both the Fish and Wildlife Service and Noaa to make informed management decisions. Specifically, it proposes reduced funding for each agency by nearly 16%. For Fish and Wildlife, that's a $250 million cut. For Noaa, it's nearly a $1 billion cut. While the President touts his dedication to growing the economy and creating jobs, the reality is this budget would be devastating to Americans whose livelihoods depend on coastal, ocean, and wildlife resources. And I expect that some on this committee will applaud the budget cuts and call them fiscally wise. But reducing funding for science, wildlife, and communities working to increase resiliency in the face of climate change is not wise. It's just passing the buck to our kids and grandkids who will pay the price for these short-sighted, irresponsible decisions down the road. From climate change denial to a national debt that is ballooning thanks to huge tax cuts to billionaires, to budgets like this that abrogate any notion of stewardship for future generations, young people today could be forgiven for thinking that the generation currently in power is reckless and hedonistic. One way this House can reject this generational theft agenda is to insist on sustainable management of our resources using best available science so that the jobs and economies that depend on natural systems will be there for future generations. We should push back on the administration's proposal to disinvest in critical science and research programs that are necessary to inform resource management decisions. One example is the commercial and recreational fishing economy, which supports 1.7 million jobs in America, generated over $200 billion in revenue last year. With the President's proposed budget cuts of $100 million to NIMFs, our main federal agency overseeing this blue economy will struggle to manage fisheries, to enforce existing regulations, and to collect critical scientific data. Now, NIMFs is already operating on a shoestring. Further cuts will only harm American fishermen, whether it's fishermen struggling because of President Trump's trade wars or those enduring multiple fishery disasters, like those in my district, where tribes and commercial fishermen suffered major disasters in 2015 and 2016, and the economic hardship from that was compounded by bureaucratic red tape. These folks still have not received a dime of the federal disaster relief they're entitled to. When you have to wait nearly 4 years for fishery disaster relief, many fishermen can't stay in business. It is unacceptable. And I hope today that we'll hear some answers from Noaa as to why this process takes so long. We also must act with urgency on the reality of climate change. We need to dedicate significantly more resources to supporting coastal communities facing sea level rise and making our oceans and coasts more resilient. Many of the programs the administration describes as low priority are crucial to supporting coastal communities across the nation, preparing them for the impacts of climate change, including the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, Sea Grant, and Coastal Zone Management Program, and Title IX. The administration has proposed to eliminate all of these programs. Folks, in the likely event that the rapture isn't just around the corner, we really need to start thinking about future generations. That includes conservation of imperiled wildlife, which we know is going to be more challenging as climate change worsens. The President's budget offers some nice words about recovering species listed under the ESA, but the administration continues to severely underfund ESA programs, making it impossible for agencies to meet recovery targets, to provide necessary protections for imperiled species, and make no mistake, this is an extinction budget, coupled with a matching extinction policy agenda. In addition to the deep budget cuts, we are seeing the administration roll out new rules to significantly erode the ESA. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is under attack, and efforts are underway to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling. It comes as no surprise that the big winner in this agenda is the fossil fuel and mining industries. The big losers are coastal and recreational economies, wildlife, indigenous people, and future generations. So today we have with us Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet from Noaa and Margaret Everson from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you for joining us. These budget hearings are an important part of the democratic process, and the cooperation of the administration is essential. We have a lot of questions regarding these priorities and this agenda, and I hope the witnesses will answer them honestly and directly. With that, I would like to invite the ranking member to say a few remarks, and then we'll welcome and hear testimony from our witnesses.
I thank the chairman. If he would check the figures, I think he'll find that the federal government is taking in record tax revenues after the tax cuts, precisely because of the economic expansion that those tax cuts made possible. The reason the deficit is expanding is because our spending is growing much faster than our revenues, and that is the core of the problem. The subcommittee meets today to hear testimonies from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regarding their fiscal year 2020 budget requests of $4.46 billion and $2.8 billion, respectively. This represents an 18% reduction in Noaa and a 3% reduction in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These savings are largely affected by prioritizing the core missions of protecting life and property, while reducing unproductive grants to outside groups, duplicative climate research, and reflecting the end of the Deepwater Horizon settlement. Frankly, I wish the President had gone farther and consolidated the Fish and Wildlife Service with the National Marine Fisheries Service, an efficiency reform long advocated by reformers on both sides of the aisle. In fact, in his State of the Union address in 2011, no less a far right-wing icon than Barack Obama himself cited these two agencies as his favorite example of counterproductive and wasteful overlap among federal agencies. He went even further when he formally proposed moving Noaa entirely into the Department of Interior in his fiscal year 2013 budget request. Unfortunately, Congress failed to follow through. Maintaining two agencies with such overlapping duties is manifestly wasteful, but it has also become comically counterproductive with tragic consequences. A prime example is what happened during the drought in California several years ago. Operations of the Federal Central Valley Project and the California State Water Project in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta required biological opinions from both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NMFS relating to impacts on the Delta smelt and certain species of listed salmon, respectively. On March 31, 2016, after reviewing Reclamation's March forecast and water supply allocation, NMFS sent a concurrence letter. 2 weeks after sending his concurrence letter, NMFS changed its mind and proposed to limit releases from Shasta Dam through the summer and into the fall in order to preserve cold water for winter-run Chinook salmon. Now, at the same time that NMFS sought to reduce Bay Delta outflow for the salmon, Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to increase it for the Delta smelt. At a July 2016 hearing of this subcommittee, the Water Policy Administrator for the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority testified that the situation, quote, squeezed virtually all of the operational flexibility from the projects, causing the damaging effects of the natural drought to amplify the chronic water supply shortages of the regulatory drought, with devastating effect throughout the Central Valley Project service area, but especially in the San Joaquin Valley. Fortunately, in 2016, the previous administration began the process of scrapping this old and flawed biological opinions using the most updated science. On October 19th of 2018, President Trump transmitted the presidential memorandum on promoting the reliable supply and delivery of water in the West. Among other things, this memorandum required streamlining the Western water infrastructure regulatory process and required the Secretary of Interior to submit his biological assessment for the Central Valley Project and the California State Water Project by January 2019. The memorandum also instructs the two agencies in front of us today to issue their respective final biological opinions on the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project within 135 days. We are quickly approaching that deadline, and I hope to hear from both of our witnesses here today that their respective agencies will adhere to the President's directive. I also hope to hear some assurance today that this Marx Brothers days of dysfunction between the two agencies are over. During the last drought, we suffered catastrophic water shortage in the West, exacerbated by NIMF's and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's inability to work as a cohesive unit. And I look forward to hearing that testimony and those reassurances. I yield back.
All right, I will now introduce our witnesses. I'd like to welcome Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'd also like to welcome Margaret Everson, Principal Deputy Director, exercising the authority of the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Welcome to both of our witnesses. Let me remind you that under our committee rules, you are to limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will appear in the record. When you begin, you'll obviously see a light that starts out as green. When there's 1 minute left, it'll turn yellow, and red means it is time to wind up. I'll allow the panel to conclude before bringing it back to the members for their questions. The chair now recognizes Admiral Gallaudet for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the President's FY20 budget request. Noaa appreciates the continued support of Congress, the administration, and all of our stakeholders. Our FY20 budget request of approximately $4.5 billion is focused on supporting NOAA's core mission areas and advancing our highest priorities, which are, number one, to reduce the impacts of extreme weather and water events by implementing the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act. Number two, to maximize the economic contributions of our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes, otherwise known as the Blue Economy. And number three, to advance space innovation. While my remarks today will focus on NOAA's wet side, I will point out that our dry side FY20 budget investments in the Earth Prediction Innovation Center, or EPIC, for modeling and novel observation technologies arising from our NOAA Satellite Observation System Architecture Study will provide leap-ahead advances in our weather and climate prediction capabilities that will support public safety, national security, and the economy. Maximizing our nation's blue economy, comprised of sustainable fishing, shipping, tourism, energy development, coastal resilience, and other activities tied to the ocean coast and Great Lakes, is a high priority for NOAA. The FY20 budget makes the necessary investments to implement the administration's ocean policy that is focused on making data available to the states, coastal communities, and industries so that they can make informed decisions to sustainably manage their offshore waters. The budget includes an additional $4 million for regional ocean data portals, building on innovative tools being developed by NOAA's National Ocean Service to improve siting and conservation considerations for offshore activities. The FY20 budget also makes investments in our fishermen and seafood production. The budget includes an investment for regional fishery management councils to analyze and remove outdated, unnecessary, or ineffective regulations. To further level the playing field for U.S. fishermen in the global seafood marketplace, the budget includes an additional $1.6 million to enforce the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, which prevents the importation of seafood caught illegally. Aquaculture is a critical component of today's seafood supply. This budget invests in assisting the aquaculture industry with regulatory compliance and conducting research to ensure that American farmed seafood is healthy, safe, and sustainable. The FY20 budget builds on the great strides NOAA has made in the last 2 years to reduce the time needed for environmental reviews. In comparison to pre-2018, the time to complete informal Endangered Species Act, or ESA, consultations was reduced by over 65%, formal ESA consultations by 22%, incidental harassment authorizations under the Marine Mammal Protection Act by 25%, and the time to get a research permit for ESA-listed species by 29%. This budget continues to invest in finding efficiencies for ESA and MMPA permitting processes without compromising the quality of our work. This budget also helps the marine transportation industry by providing funds for precision navigation tools and products to help maximize cargo transport. The budget increases funds for unmanned systems to innovate cost-effective ways for marine data collection. In addition, it increases efforts to reduce marine debris, accelerates the economic benefits of new and expanded marine sanctuaries, and reduces the backlog of natural resource damage assessment cases. Finally, the budget includes a $5 million increase for the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, which will leverage NOAA funds along with investments from other federal agencies, private industry, and philanthropic organizations to advance research in several priority areas, from ocean exploration to acoustic technology to detect and protect marine mammals. In conclusion, NOAA's FY20 budget request reflects the commitment of this administration to advance national security, the economy, and the environment. NOAA contributes to these priorities every day by putting data in the hands of those who need it. This is enabled by NOAA's supercomputers, satellites, ships, aircraft, laboratories, facilities, and most notably, our people. It is clear to me that we have one of the most competent and committed workforces across all of government. We have strong partnerships across the nation, and which NOAA's services positively impact every American life every day. I believe this budget request enables NOAA to more effectively and efficiently meet its core mission. Thank you for the opportunity to present NOAA's FY20 budget request. I look forward to working with the members of the committee, our partners, and the American people to achieve NOAA's priority goals. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rear Admiral. The chair now recognizes Ms. Everson for 5 minutes.
Thank you and good afternoon. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the 2020 budget request for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I am the Principal Deputy Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I will speak briefly about our budget. I would like to submit my full written testimony and statement for the record. The President's budget requests $1.3 billion for the service. This is over $101 million higher than our budget request for last year. The request makes key investments that will increase access to outdoor recreational opportunities, improve permitting, modernize infrastructure, address invasive species, and promote the recovery of imperiled species and their habitats. It emphasizes the importance of expanding opportunities for all Americans to access public lands and experience the great outdoors. And the request controls costs through management efficiencies and other savings to address government fiscal realities. As members of this subcommittee know, the service administers the National Wildlife Refuge System, sustaining the American tradition started by Teddy Roosevelt. The 567 refuges in the service system provide lands and waters for countless species of wildlife and plants, including hundreds of endangered species. And they provide world-class recreational opportunities for the American public. In 2018, over 55 million visitors hunted, fished, and recreated on refuges. Thanks to these visitors, refuges are economic engines and drivers in local communities. The budget requests over $509 million to administer the refuge system. This is the largest request ever for the refuge system and will enable us to significantly enhance outdoor recreational opportunities in rural, urban, and suburban landscapes, as well as to support the vital role of volunteers on refuges. The request also addresses the service's maintenance and backlog needs and helps take care of the facilities and infrastructures that the service manages for the public's benefit. The service's budget request is also a significant investment in recovering imperiled species. In this administration, we have already achieved remarkable successes under the Endangered Species Act by issuing final and proposed rules to delist and downlist 20 species. By recovering species and returning them to state and tribal management, we further our commitment to being a good neighbor to states, tribes, and private landowners. Successful recovery also allows us to focus our limited resources on those species of greatest conservation need. Throughout this recovery work, we aim to strike a regulatory balance. The budget prioritizes funding for planning and consultation, allowing us to conserve fish and wildlife resources while facilitating economic development. By working with industry partners and private landowners on appropriate mitigation and avoidance measures, responsible development and conservation of wildlife can and do go hand in hand. The service's budget request emphasizes the value of partnerships in leveraging conservation success. For example, we collaborate with many partners, including national sportsmen's and conservation groups, tribes and states, to conserve birds and to preserve traditional subsistence and outdoor recreational pursuits. These collaborative efforts have been successful in conserving the habitats needed to support these migratory populations for future generations of Americans to enjoy. The service plays an integral role in combating invasive species, which cost our economy billions of dollars each year. To continue our commitment to addressing this important issue, the budget request supports programs that focus on preventing the spread of Asian carp, quagga mussels, zebra mussels, and cheatgrass. The service's work doesn't end at our nation's borders. Our international affairs program supports conservation in other countries and ensures that wildlife trade is both legal and sustainable. Wildlife trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar global business that fuels international instability and has been linked to other illicit activities such as human, arms, and drug trafficking. The budget supports innovative projects to combat wildlife trafficking. We appreciate the subcommittee's continued support of these projects. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your continued work to support the men and the women of the service and the work we do every day to further our conservation mission. I look forward to discussing the service's work and our budget request with you in the weeks and the months to come, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman for this important hearing, and there are obviously a lot of issues that are of concern of this subcommittee as it relates to waters, oceans, and wildlife, and the budget and your ability to carry out your mandate. I want to speak to something that I've been involved with for a long time, and it was touched upon earlier. President Obama, in his speech to the State of the Union, talked about an example of overlapping and what seems to be perplexing, if not contradictory, missions of both Fish and Wildlife Agency and NOAA, and with NIMS under NOAA. As I understand it, under the NOAA and NIMS's jurisdiction, you deal with oceans and water quality and fisheries in that area, right?
That's correct, sir.
And the Fish and Wildlife Service deals with freshwater fisheries and those areas in the country. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and that's the example that the president used and Congressman McClintock noted in his comments. The biological opinions, and we all, I think, subscribe, although there's our distinctions in terms of how we use best science. The biological opinions that had a great deal to deal with in terms of the operation of the water projects, the federal water projects in California in not only 2011 during the height of the drought, but in 2016, there were a group of us that wrote a letter to Secretary Jewell and to Secretary Pritzker at the time, pointing out the frustration and the overlapping, what seemed to be contradictions in the mandates of how waters were applied for both, in this case, salmon and delta smelt that have been listed. And my question to you is, I know historically, at least I'm told why, the separation of the two jurisdictions that goes back to Secretary Walter Hickel. I'm not going to rehash that, but I would like to know, in the new biological opinions that are being worked on, if we're going to be able to straighten out this overlapping in what sometimes in 2016 and certainly 2011 before was two federal agencies that were at odds with one another, to put it lightly, in terms of the management of the water projects.
Thank you, Congressman, for your question.
And in part because salmon cover both your jurisdictions, obviously. They swim out in the ocean, but they swim upriver and they spawn.
That's correct, sir. Well, and I'll answer specifically and broadly, and first specifically about the
I've only got 1:55.
Central
Quickly.
Valley Water Project and the State Water Project. We are working on our final biological opinion and expect to have that completed by 1 July. We're just in the final rounds of working with the Bureau of Reclamation in their assessment as we work that jointly. Speaking broadly, the Department of Interior and NOAA, specifically Fish and Wildlife Service, and several other agencies have committed to working together and reducing inconsistency between our interpretations of the Endangered Species Act. That's why we've issued 3 proposed rules that align our interpretation of consultations under Section 7. And we've also been following the President's presidential memorandum together jointly, as Ranking Member McClintock mentioned. And so we're committed to reducing the redundancy and sometimes inconsistent messages that came from our 2 agencies.
Well, inconsistency is putting it nicely. I mean, they were frankly in contradiction of one another, and it exacerbated what was already below average rainfall. Part of the operations of the projects now, we have, as noted, a hearing last week, 76% of normal snowpack. Yet we have some of the San Luis Water Agency that, because of the biological opinions and movement of water, cannot get above that at this point in time. Have you looked into that and the considerations and the impacts on the lack of flexibility?
Yes, Congressman, we have. And in fact, in the President's memorandum, there's a specific Section 3 which NOAA is leading an implementation plan on to better improve our predictive capability of water from snowpack and other sources.
Yeah, with climate change and sea levels rising, I think it's incumbent that we use the best science available, and every drop of water, as the chairman of the subcommittee knows, is precious.
Indeed.
And we thank you for your time, and we'll continue to work on this.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Admiral Gallaudet, to follow up on that line of questioning regarding the President's memorandum, he gave you 135 days to respond. Are you going to be making that deadline?
I'm sorry,
Are you
Congressman,
going to be
didn't hear
making,
you.
the President gave 135 days. Are you going to be making that deadline? Great.
Yes, sir.
And Ms. Everson, you agree?
We are working diligently to meet the deadlines. We understand, as the Admiral laid out, that we have a July 1st deadline to complete the biological opinion, and are committed to achieving that.
Good. Admiral Gallaudet, in 2017, the Department of Commerce Office of Inspector General issued a report outlining significant lapses in NOAA's management assessments and efficiency of their real property scattered across the United States. Do we have that chart for display? Apparently not, but if we did have it, it would show a map of all the NOAA properties, about 3,400 properties depicted. First, I'd commend the agency for taking initial steps to consolidate some of these facilities, but obviously there is still a great deal of work to do. Do you think that all these properties are essential to NOAA's core functions?
Congressman, I do think they're performing essential services for the American people, but we do recognize the fact that we can be more efficient. So in our budget, for example, we have proposed the termination of the National Center for Coastal Ocean Sciences, and that would reduce some part of our facilities footprint. We're also underway in a strategic facilities master plan development, which would target these potential efficiencies and find ways to achieve them.
Well, it is hard to look at that map and read the Inspector General's report and accept the proposition that those are all doing great work for the American people.
Congressman, I believe that the individuals within NOAA that are across the country are performing essential service for the American people, and I would highlight the fact that that map does not represent individual NOAA buildings. Many of those places where the people are shared facilities with partners across the interagency.
I don't think you're getting the message that there is great concern over the efficiency of your operation, and another aspect of it was the fact that in 2016, NOAA Corps requested $178 million for marine operations and maintenance to support approximately 3,200 days at sea. In 2020, your agency requested $192 million to provide 2,300 days at sea. That's a decrease of almost a third in days at sea, while an increase in the budget. It seems the price keeps increasing for taxpayers while the Noaa Corps lowers its productivity. Can you explain why it costs more to provide less to the American taxpayers?
Yes, Congressman. With regards to our ship days at sea before this administration, I really can't comment on how that was determined, but presently, our Office of Marine and Aviation Operations determines that sea time based on mission requirements balanced with maintenance requirements. Currently, we have an aging fleet. 3 of our ships are over 50 years old. 8 of them will exceed their design service life by 2028. And therefore, it makes our fleet a recapitalization plan an imperative.
The problem with that answer, of course, is that Congress has been asking these questions since the 1990s, and report after report's concluded that NOAA's fleet of ships are costly, inefficient, and lack technology that the private sector can offer at a far lower cost. The Department of Commerce Inspector General has even recommended NOAA terminate its fleet modernization efforts. The most recent report found that the Noaa Corps failed to track administrative costs for a decade and continuously fails to develop a strategy to expand private sector cost-effective data collection as required by law. According to recent conversations with the GAO, NOAA has yet to establish a process to do so. How do you plan on addressing financial issues within the Noaa Corps?
Congressman, so with our fleet recapitalization plan, we do intend to become more efficient through reducing the deferred maintenance, and I thank the Congress for resourcing.
Well, let me ask you that very question. $300 million for fleet recapitalization. What does your agency have to show for a significant taxpayer investment?
Sir, exactly. I would say that in terms of making a change in terms of efficiency, it's sort of like turning the rudder over on a large warship, which I have experience doing. It takes time to get onto course and speed. We put the rudder over, but we're now in a point where as we recapitalize our fleet, we'll be finding and becoming more efficient.
My time's expired.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Welcome, Admiral and Ms. Emerson. Admiral, I want to know what about the NOAA budget cuts proposed by the administration. I mean, my goodness, how are we going to get things done, right? So, as you know, the Northern Maryland's Bureau of Environmental Quality receives virtually almost all of its funding from the federal government, principally NOAA and EPA. Its coastal programs and innovative coral reef restoration are essential to our economy and our way of life, let alone changing, rising sea levels, changing climates. The proposed $211 million cut to National Ocean Service is of great concern. In particular, I have strenuous objections to the elimination of the Coastal Zone Management grants, which provided $1.1 million to the Marianas in fiscal year 19, and the severe cuts to the Integrated Ocean Observing System regional grants, which fund our Pacific IOOS that provides essential data on ocean conditions at a place where we just had a super typhoon, the largest in our history, second largest in our history. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 9 different fiscal year 20 appropriations request letters that I co-signed with many of my colleagues to address these imperative funding issues. Now, Admiral, how can NOAA perform its mission, help support economic activity, and reduce threats to climate change and severe weather events with drastic cuts like this? You're a smart man. Tell me how.
Thank you, Congressman. I can tell you how. And if
you support the cuts.
I support the cuts, Congressman. We cut, our strategy was to cut grants to states and territories and external partners while we preserved core functions and missions. So, for example, we are not eliminating, we are continuing great work funded on the order of tens of millions of dollars of the Coastal Zone Management Program, as well as the IUS program. And for IUS, for example, we believe that some of our innovative increases will be able to address some of the reductions in IUS. For example, we are adding $4 million to increase our operations of unmanned systems. We're also adding $2 million to increase the number of commercial ship data purchases we'll provide. And then we're also advancing our satellite capabilities and space-derived
Admiral,
environmental data.
Admiral, you know, for example, and this is not your department, we have one Coast Guard ship that goes throughout, that is responsible for the entire Pacific, almost the entire Pacific Oceans, and they're supposed to catch IUUs and those things, and that one. And just imagine, this is the size that's as large as the 48 contiguous states. So I don't know how you could say you support the cost of 211 million. But let me ask you something more small in nature. I want to know about your recent audit of the Western Pacific Sustainable Fisheries Funds, Admiral, as required by Senate Report 115-139. Noaa states that it funds activities using the Western Pacific Sustainable Fisheries Fund and that there are no fund or grant programs controlled or managed by Western Pacific Fishery Council, WESPAC, even though it later refers to WESPAC as the granting entity. WESPAC writes the contracts, selects the awardees, and decides how and when the work is to be performed, correct?
That's my understanding, Congressman.
So how can you clearly state what role WESPAC plays in money coming out of the Sustainable Fisheries Fund when you said they don't?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't quite understand your question, and if
How can you clearly state what role WESPAC plays in money coming out of the Sustainable Fisheries Fund after saying that there are no fund or grant programs controlled or managed by WESPAC?
Congressman, I'm not aware of the grant programs associated with WESPAC, but I can tell you that
these are grant programs of the Western Pacific Sustainable Fisheries Fund.
Congressman, I'll have to take that for the record. I apologize.
All right, I'm out of time. I have other questions. May I submit them for the record, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Admiral. Thank you, Ms. Emerson.
Thank you, sir.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. We appreciate your insights. Ms. Everson, in your testimony, you highlight the threat of invasive species and how they can overwhelm ecosystems and cost our economy billions of dollars every year. And you also talk about creating what we refer to as strike teams to combat invasive species around the country. We have an Asian carp problem. It's well documented in the upper Mississippi River. I'm from Louisiana. I understand that keeping that species out of the Great Lakes has been a priority, but a lot of people in the lower Mississippi River area and along the Red River in my district are concerned about the spread of the species in our part of the country. And so the question is, can you go into any detail about the type of activities that these strike teams will conduct, and can we expect to see them in areas along the lower Mississippi River and its tributaries?
Thank you so much for that question, Congressman. As you laid out, invasive species, particularly Asian carp, is incredibly important to the Fish and Wildlife Service and to many of our partners, including our partners in the state agencies. This is something that we all need to tackle together. This has been an issue that I've certainly personally been working on since my days in Kentucky. Regardless of where this invasive species lives in the ecosystem. And so speaking specifically to additional investments that the service has made, as well as the work that the strike teams will be doing. One of the things I want to really emphasize in this is the collaboration up and down the Mississippi, as well as the Great Lakes, working with a large variety of partners and communities to make sound science investments, to be able to address what is control and hopefully eventually eradication of this species. As you know, it has tremendous economic impacts in these communities. It's something that we continue to be concerned about. We continue to invest staff, time, and resources in, and we continue to work with our state and local partners to be able to get ahead and control this issue.
You think eradication is actually possible?
I would like to think so, sir.
It's very optimistic. I'm going to join you in that. You also talk about the ESA in your testimony and how the administration's working to improve the act and ultimately lead to the recovery of species, another optimistic outcome that we hope is true. There are, however, some glaring issues with the ESA, as we know, particularly with respect to critical habitat designations and drawing distinctions between protections for threatened species versus endangered species. And these issues have popped up in Louisiana, in my home state. We have a gopher frog issue that no one's seen since the 60s. We have the Louisiana pine snake that's this mythical creature, supposedly lives 6 feet underground and stops harvesting of woodlands. They're placing heavy burdens on the rights of landowners. And so I appreciate your efforts to engage with stakeholders to improve the act through a series of proposed rulemaking. So the question is, can you give us a status update on where things stand on that, and particularly with clarity on the critical habitat designations and distinguishing between threatened species and endangered species?
Great, thank you, Congressman. And I appreciate your comments and your focus on this issue. It's certainly one that is tremendously important to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and also to get it right. We are working to finalize these regulations. We're getting very close. As I understand it, we are in the final round of interagency review, and I expect that you will see these rules in final in the very, very near future. Being able to address court decisions, like the one you mentioned in your district, being able to respond with certainty are all concepts that are important to this administration, and that I believe that you will see captured in our final rulemaking.
That's great. I have a minute left. I understand you have a lot of experience with regard to our wetlands and migratory birds. As I'm sure you know, Noaa is up for reauthorization this year, and wanted to know if you could speak to some of the successes of the program, particularly as it relates to wetlands restoration and enhanced opportunities for recreation and sporting groups.
Well, I appreciate that. Actually, because of my involvement in my previous employer, I'm recused from a lot of those issues, but we would be happy to answer for the record about the successes of that program, and we'll make sure that we're responsive to that.
The old recusal thing, I know. Hey, thank you for your time. Appreciate you both.
Thank you so much,
Yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cox for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Admiral and Senator Everson, for being here today. In my district, California's 21, there are a couple national wildlife refuges in Kern County and Pixley, California. And from what I kind of understand that the Bureau of Reclamation is proposing to change how it collects and pays for projects out of the restoration fund. And part of the proposal, I guess, is to smooth out collection and distribution of the funding, which currently varies on an annual basis. And, you know, with the Fish and Wildlife Service being a direct recipient of the money to use for refuge management, I guess, are you aware of the proposal? And how have you been coordinating with Reclamation to assess the potential impacts on staffing and projects, including habitat improvements and water acquisitions in the Central Valley of California?
Thank you, Congressman. As you are aware, particularly in the Central Valley of California, we work very closely with the Bureau of Reclamation. Specific to this issue, our teams continue to coordinate on these proposals by the Bureau of Reclamation, and we move forward together, again, in a collaborative process.
Oh, great. And are you specifically aware of this proposal to, I guess, change how you're collecting and paying for projects out of this restoration fund?
I would have to get back to you on the specifics of that. I am certainly aware that both of our teams, Commissioner Berman and our team in our Sacramento office, have been working through these issues, and I'd be happy to provide, for the record, the specifics of that.
Yeah, because once again, is that the particular answers we're looking for is, one, how is it going to affect staffing, and really funding for maintenance and capital improvement projects there in the Central Valley.
Okay, I'd be happy to respond to that, and those are certainly priorities.
And certainly, and the other thing is, and it affects everybody, that Fish and Wildlife Service is that public access is so important. And from what I understand as well, is that Fish and Wildlife was directed to review hunter and sportsman opportunities on public refuge land. And as a big hunter and fisherman myself, very keenly interested in that subject. And so what's the status of the review, and where are you on the process?
Great. So this has been a priority for this administration. 2 years ago, we announced over 180,000 new opportunities on refuge lands for hunting and fishing access. Last year, we announced 251,000 new and expanded opportunities. This year, in 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to be proposing historic levels of access. As the Secretary said in his hearing last week, this year's numbers could top 1 million acres of new opportunities, which, as you know, are tremendous economic drivers in local communities.
Right, and just sometime later this year, any?
So the intent on this, the clear intent, the proposal will be going out by the first week in June. So the final rule will come out before dove season. So the final rule will come out by the end of August in time for the fall hunting season.
Fantastic. And apologize for coming a little late, and I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Costa, must have touched on it, but regarding the CVT and California State Water Project biological opinions, which are due out later in June. And I guess we want to make sure that the resources available have been dedicated to making sure that those biops are delivered on time. And more so, is there been any collaboration between the Fish and Wildlife Service, I mean, I know there is, and Noaa to resolve conflicting requirements for operations of the Central Valley Project that's going to come out as you draft these opinions?
I'm happy to take that one. As I'm sure you're aware, the President put forward a memorandum making sure that we had definite deadlines, as well as ensuring collaboration between the services. This is something that we take very seriously and is going very well. As we mentioned previously, to finalize the biological opinion, we have a July 1 deadline that we will meet on that.
And you will be delivering it on July 1.
We will.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Now, you'll the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank the Admiral and Fish and Wildlife for the excellent work that you did after the Hurricane Irma and Maria on the islands, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I mean, we are used to hurricanes, but that last one in 2017 were, I think, in 100 years, the worst of those. And I know the efforts for protecting different areas. Your staff there have been working with our office in a very, very productive way. And according to the data of the website of the FEMA Recovery and Support Function, Noaa has been allocated approximately $21 million for disaster relief efforts in Puerto Rico. 11.4 were for Fisheries Disaster Assistance, 9.1 million were allocated under the Operations Research and Facilities account. $500,000 were allocated under the Procurement, Acquisition, and Construction account. Yet, until March 31st of this year, Noaa has only obligated $7.5 million of this funding, and less than $800,000 had actually been outlaid or delivered to the island. Can you tell me why is the reason a lot of these funds haven't arrived yet to the island? And if you can provide this committee, I don't expect you to give me that information right now, but later on, to provide the committee the breakdown of how Noaa has utilized the $21 million in disaster relief funding in Puerto Rico, and why so little has been released.
Yes, Congressman, we can provide you the breakdown on that. I don't know the nature of those specific funds, but I do know the complete nature of all the work we've done for Puerto Rico since Hurricane Maria, and actually well before it, because our National Weather Service and Satellite and Data Information Service provided very ample warning that saved many lives. But following the hurricane, we've been involved in a whole array of work. We've had our ship, Noaa's ship, Thomas Jefferson, conducting surveys all around the island and opening up 13 very important navigation channels. We've had teams on the ground, and I work personally with my contacts in the Department of Defense to restore the weather radar at the Weather Forecast
And I
Office.
want to say thank you again for the radars situation. Many people are not aware that during the hurricane we lost our Doppler. And we lost also the radars of our airports. So there was no way to get in and out of the island without the radars in the airport. And it was the Department of Defense with you guys working to provide a lot of navigation systems during that time. I have the same questions to Fish and Wildlife. According to FEMA Recovery Support Function, $3.2 million were allocated for disaster relief, specifically for construction. However, at March 31st of this year, just $1 million has been released, obligated, I may say, and less than $500,000 are being outlaid. So I want to know, in both agencies, what are the obstacles for the outlaying the money? I mean, the Congress approved this money in the fastest way ever. The president signed it. All the agencies are boots on the ground. But why that money is not being outlaid? And this is something that is happening in your agencies as many others. So I would love to have the breakdown as well in the case of Fish and Wildlife. And in the case of Puerto Rico, I don't know if you were aware, 4 of the 7 sea turtles are found on the island. So we know that recently we make changes to the Marine Turtle Conservation Fund. I want to know if the territories, U.S. territories, are eligible to apply for funding from the Marine Turtle Conservation Fund during the fiscal year that we're talking here. That could be something that I would like to have more of an input and for the record as well, because I'm running out of time. I would like to know how we can assist both of the agencies. And first, getting the money out. And second, you talk about the blue economy. And in the case of Puerto Rico, approximately 7% of our economy is running because of the oceans and our reef areas. And that's actually 2% more times than the people living in the Great Lakes or any other state. For being in an island, and I know this is the same situation for the rest of the territories as well, how we can improve that program. You did a report in 2016 outlaying the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean efforts for the blue ocean. How we can get it forward, and I will provide some other questions for the record, because I know I just finished my time.
Did you have a brief response? Or?
Yes, Congresswoman, I will provide that answer, but I can tell you that I visited Puerto Rico and Culebra afterwards and witnessed firsthand the work we're doing to restore coral reefs, eelgrass habitat for turtles, and much other things with your Ocean Observing System Association to get the services that are so essential to Puerto Rico's blue economy.
All right, thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Both witnesses have been asked about the reconsultation process for California's Central Valley project, and reference has been made to an order that President Trump signed, setting in motion a very tight time frame that you're working under. Now, that was a politicized order. It took place just before the midterm election in the political battleground of California's San Joaquin Valley, to much media fanfare at the time. And I want to just ask each of you within your respective agencies, have any of your staff expressed concern with the lack of staff or resources to properly complete complex biological opinions on a time frame far shorter than previous biological opinions for this project have had to operate? Have any staff expressed concern about meeting that deadline within the current resource constraints?
Mr. Chairman, as far as Noaa is concerned, I have not heard any frustration from staff, and you heard me cite the improvements in ESA consultations and MMPA IHAs, and that's just because we've been working with our careers to become more efficient.
Ms. Everson, any staff concerns about lack of staff or resources to get this done in short order?
Well, first I would like to say that no, but first I would like to say that I'm very proud of the team that Fish and Wildlife Service has.
We can stipulate it's a great team. I'm just
Working
wondering
on
how
this
they're...
and making sure that they have the resources that they need to meet these deadlines.
Okay, I am aware that Fish and Wildlife has put part of the analysis for this process under independent peer review, and each of the reviewers expressed concern with the science used in those within that analysis. So, Ms. Everson, I want to ask you to please describe how your agency will work to ensure that the deficiencies identified in that peer review are addressed and that the best available science is reflected in what ultimately comes out of this consultation.
I can commit to you, the Fish and Wildlife Service is a science-driven agency, and we always use the best available science in making our decisions and determinations. This will be no different.
All right. It's obviously important that the public have confidence that there are no conflicts of interest, that politics are not at play here, especially when the Secretary of Interior is the former lawyer and lobbyist for one of the major water districts that stands to benefit from this reconsultation. So I want to ask you each if you will release any emails between the Westlands Water District and your agencies regarding the new smelt and salmon biological opinions.
We take all the requests from this committee and from Congress very seriously. I would be happy to work with the department on that request.
All right, thank you, Rear Admiral.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we will do the same in working with the Department of Commerce in assessing and fielding your request.
Great. I hope I can take that as an agreement to share the information requested. Rear Admiral, I want to ask you a little about fishery disaster money. You heard me mention that in my opening remarks. I have fishermen that are waiting more than 4 years to get the disaster relief they're entitled to. Now, I've gone back and taken a look at this administration and prior administrations. On average, it seems like it takes about a year for your agency to make the decision to approve or deny a fishery disaster declaration. I'm curious as to why it takes that long, especially since we have a couple of examples very recently, a Florida fishery disaster where it took 8 days to turn around a decision. And then with the recent hurricane in 2017, about 4 months in one case, 1 month in the other. But certainly as it pertains to California's fishery disasters, we seem to be on a much less prioritized track for turnaround by the agencies. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. First off, we don't prioritize based on location. We march down the list as they come in. But second,
how did Florida get an 8-day turnaround then?
Well, I know that it's based on the data, and sometimes it's an easier case to make than others depending upon the data. But all of this is done on really rigorous scientific analysis so that we make the most effective and efficient
What was
use.
different about the data Florida submitted and the data California has submitted for its disasters?
I will have to get back to you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I appreciate it. Was there any political pressure exerted by Governor Scott, for example, in Florida?
I know of none of that, sir, but I will say that we have just recently, I think, issued $63 million from the 2018 disaster supplemental, and it went to Washington and California for the fishery disasters there.
We appreciate that very much. We just would like to see these decisions made a little more timely. So with that, I will recognize Mr. Graves, I believe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, thank you for being here. Thank you both for being here. Appreciate you coming to the committee and testifying today. Admiral, in Louisiana, we've got a coastal land loss crisis. We've lost about 2,000 square miles of our coast, and we have been carrying out a multi-billion-dollar restoration plan, and I just want to be clear, the restoration plan is designed to restore ecological productivity. We ran into an issue last Congress where I worked with my friend Mr. Huffman on a solution through the House whereby essential fish habitat was being applied to our restoration projects. So playing through this scenario, here we have coastal wetlands erode, it becomes open water, we want to come back and restore it, and NIMS is telling us that we have to mitigate for the essential fish habitat we're taking away. And I asked Noaa last Congress and the one before, did the fish mitigate for taking our human habitat away? And the answer, of course, was no. Just applying common sense, see if I can come up with the right word, it's just stupid. It is, and it delays projects, and it drives up the cost of projects. And I'll say it again, the entire objective of these projects is restoring ecological function. We're not coming in to pave a parking lot or something. Do you think it's reasonable that essential fish habitat is applied that way to projects that are as part of a coastal master plan, brought some of the best scientists in the world together, that it's applied that way, driving up cost and delaying projects?
I'd have to look at each case, Congressman, but I appreciate your interest. I can tell you broadly that we are committed to restoration of wetlands in Louisiana. I've been to your state 3 times since I've been here over the year and a half that I've been in at Noaa. And in fact, I was just last week visiting Baton Rouge as well as some of our assets down near Slidell, Louisiana. And that is a top area of interest. And I received extensive briefings from our scientific partners at LSU. And so we are funding much in your state to restore those wetlands. And so I think, as I said in my opening statement, we want to do the most for potential users and partners in coastal areas to maximize sustainable use.
Admiral, I want to request if you could please exert a little bit of leadership in the application of some of these decisions. Look, let me be clear. I'm an avid fisher and very much support our recreational commercial industry and understand the role that our coast in Louisiana with that estuary plays for the overall health of the Gulf of Mexico. But it's just a flawed approach. And I'll tell you, rather than having cooperation from NIMS, we ran into problems on this. We ran into problems on Marine Mammal Protection Act application with one of our diversion projects where we worked on a bipartisan basis, ending up putting a provision in our PROPS bill that was cleared by this committee that told them to just issue the permit for the freshwater reintroduction project mid-Maritaria and for Calcasieu. So I just want to ask, look, y'all need to be a partner with us on this rather than an obstacle or an opponent. This is something that requires all of the resources of our federal government there helping to reverse this trend that we've been seeing now for many, many decades. It truly is a coastal crisis. It affects not just the production of the Gulf of Mexico, the overall Gulf of Mexico, not just Louisiana. As you well know, over 90% of the species in the Gulf are dependent upon the coastal wetlands in Louisiana for their life cycle. And it's a really important thing, and having these obstructions has been incredibly frustrating. Last thing I want to throw up is having to do with surveys. I understand that you're working to recapitalize your Noaa core, and I'll just put my comments on the shelf in regard to that for a minute. But in the interim, it seems that there are other solutions, and as we both know, they've had a number of private companies that have come up and offered different scenarios, everything from doing the surveys themselves to offering their vessels up for lease and other scenarios that seem that they could be cost-effective interim strategies, if not long-term, and just wanted to get your quick thoughts on that.
Yes, Congressman, thank you for your interest in our survey capability. We do contract up about half of the at-sea days for hydrographic surveying. We retain our Noaa fleet in large part because oftentimes surge capacity is required that contract support cannot provide. And we demonstrated that, for example, in Puerto Rico in response to the Hurricane Maria. We did the same this year along the entire Gulf Coast after Hurricane Michael, as well as the Carolinas in response to Hurricane Florence to open up the navigational channels and ports.
I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying that y'all tried to get private capacity and that was not available, so you had to use your own? Is that what after the hurricanes?
Yes, sir. After the hurricanes, we used our own and did not try to contract it out because the contracting process would have taken too long.
Okay, got it. Which, Mr. Chairman, may be a whole other thing we could address. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here.
Add it to the list.
Thank you, sir.
All right, the chair recognizes Mr. Cunningham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank our witnesses for arriving and testify today, and I would like to yield my time back to the chair.
Well, I thank the gentleman very much. And Ms. Everson, I want to ask you about the lease plan for the Arctic Refuge. I've brought this up with the Interior Department before, but so far haven't gotten any answers regarding the 19 memos from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm sure you're familiar with these memos. They highlighted data gaps and missing information regarding oil and gas drilling on the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. They cover everything from subsistence use to polar bears to air quality, impacts on vegetation, and more. And the cover memo was titled Priority Information Needs for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge 1002 Area. It states that in addition to the information needed on polar bears, there are 10 priority studies for meeting near-term regulatory requirements and informing the BLM-led EIS for this area. So, and at least one of these studies was estimated to require 4 years and about $2.7 million. In any event, is there any money for any of these studies in the budget? All right, I need a very specific answer to that, so I will ask you to follow up. Were any of these studies completed before BLM issued the leasing EIS in December?
I am not familiar specifically with the documents that you're referring to, so I'd have to follow up with the record.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. Look, the evidence would suggest we have a large multi-year polar bear study, 10 other priority studies that fish and wildlife scientists have said are necessary to inform the EIS, and yet we have an EIS that was completed without any of these things. So I am very much looking forward to your answer. Rear Admiral Gallaudet, I want to ask you about the Pebble Mine. I have written to you about this before. You and I, I'm sure, agree that Bristol Bay is one of the last great salmon strongholds. It's one of the great pristine places that we haven't yet screwed up in this country. And the previous administration, when they evaluated the environmental impacts of the proposed Pebble Mine, detailed all sorts of environmental impacts. And yet the recent draft EIS from the Army Corps of Engineers didn't consider many of the impacts outlined by the previous administration. In fact, they didn't even reference the EPA's report from the previous administration. And I'm concerned about that because Noaa has chosen not to participate in the EIS process as a cooperating agency. It seems to me that, especially given the biological and commercial significance of this amazing area, we need to ask you to explain whether your decision not to participate, and also whether you have reviewed the impacts outlined by the Army Corps' draft EIS specific to its jurisdiction, including the impacts on the Bristol Bay marine ecosystem and corresponding impacts on the various fisheries and ecosystem services in the region.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I would agree with you. I've been to Alaska several times and visited our facilities and believe it to be a wonderful and pristine ecological environment, which many of our scientists study. From my understanding, we are participating in the EIS evaluation. In fact, the last I've heard of this is that we are looking at the EIS and we'll be submitting an assessment of that and with potential impacts to NIMS Trust Resources. That's the EIS. We're also looking at essential fish habitat. And in fact, the Army Corps has completed an EFH assessment, and we are reviewing that now, and we will provide them with an EFH conservation recommendation report. And then when it comes to ESA, we are working with, again, the Army Corps of Engineers, who's the lead agency here, and for primarily the Cook Inlet area, we would conduct an ESA if requested by the Army Corps. And lastly, we also have MMPA IHA responsibilities, and I understood just as of today the Pebble Limited Partnership withdrew their request for us to do IHA review under MMPA.
So just to be clear, I'm hearing you say that you do intend to submit comments on the draft environmental impact statement.
Mr. Chairman, yes.
Do you know when those comments would be submitted?
I will have to get back to you on the time frame.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Want to thank both witnesses for their testimony and for answering our questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions, and we will ask you to answer those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit written questions to the witnesses within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there's no further business before the committee, we stand adjourned. Thank you both.
Thank you.